Hello, welcome to the debate with Jan Helfeld and David Friedman. The debate today is, the subject is no government is better than limited government, and Jan just had a fit on something.
Yeah, my wife took my water.
Okay, so we'll just continue or what?
Go ahead.
All right, so again, the subject is no government is better than limited government. David Friedman will be arguing the affirmative on that position. Dan Helfeld will be arguing the negative on that. And just a little brief introduction. I'm Mike Benoit. I'll be the moderator today. My position is a limited government, so full disclosure there. But hopefully throughout the debate, at the end of the debate, we all come out of this a little bit smarter and a little bit more right, if that's a proper term. And most of you know David Friedman. He's a well-known anarchist, a lecturer, and has written books. His most famous book, I guess, is The Machinery of Freedom, that is available. And David, do you have where people can go for that?
If they go to my webpage, which is www.daviddfriedman.com, there is a free PDF of Machinery linked at the top of the webpage. You can also buy it from Amazon, and there is going to be a third edition out as a Kindle sometime in the fairly near future.
All right, thank you. And Jan Helfeld is famous for interviewing politicians and journalists, exposing the fallacies of their positions in regards to, well, hypocrisy mostly. And for some reason, I'm not on the screen, so I don't know what went wrong there. We're still looking at David Friedman. All right, so both of you gentlemen understand the rules. You've both been sent a copy of them, and I think this will be a debate where people will follow the rules, because I've seen both of you in action as far as your communication cycles. You don't interrupt the other, and that's definitely going to lead us to a good debate. Now, with that having been said, David, you have the opening statement, and that will be a 10-minute statement. Are you ready?
Ready.
Okay, go.
Yeah. The basic problem with the libertarian limited government position is that libertarians, both anarchists and minarchists, believe that governments are bad at doing things, that if the government is in charge of producing food, if we're lucky, the food will be expensive and not taste very good, and if we're unlucky, we'll starve to death. And yet, the limited government libertarians want to put government in charge of some very critical tasks, such as making the law, enforcing the law, defending against foreign enemies. And I expect, though we'll see, that Jan will probably agree with me that if the government does those things, we can expect it to do them badly. And then the only argument in favor of government is to say that doing them badly is better than not doing them at all, and that the alternative anarchist system will be unable to do certain essential things. So I will leave it to Jan to explain his position beyond that, and see if I can sketch out how I believe a society without a government could provide the fundamental core functions that limited state libertarians think they need a government for. The system that I am imagining, which I discuss in much more detail in Machinery of Freedom, is one in which individuals are customers of firms which sell the service of protecting their rights and arranging to have their disputes settled, what I think of as rights enforcement agencies. I pay an annual fee to such an agency just as I pay it to an insurance company or some other firm, and in exchange for that, they will protect my rights. There's an obvious problem that arises that everybody thinks as soon as you discuss such a system, which is what happens if I believe that Jan has stolen my television set because the camera that my rights enforcement agency provides recorded him doing it. He denies it. My agency says to him, if you don't give back the television set and pay us a little for our time and trouble, we'll send some big strong men to take it back from you. And Jan replies, but I too have a rights enforcement agency, and it'll defend me when you send people to take what I claim is my television set. Therefore, people say there will be immediately violence between these agencies and the system will break down. That was Ayn Rand's argument and other people's. And it's wrong. And it's wrong because violence is an expensive and unreliable way of settling disputes. That from the standpoint of both rights enforcement agencies, it makes much more sense for them to agree that when such a dispute arises, they will have it arbitrated, and that each of them will go along with the result of the arbitration. If you imagine the beginning of such a system, it might be ad hoc arbitration, but once it's established, each pair of agencies that expect to have conflicts between their customers find it in their interest to agree in advance on a private court, an arbitration agency, which court will then settle disputes between them. Now you might ask, what will enforce their agreement, since there is no government to enforce contracts in this world? It's a stateless world. And the answer is that it is enforced by what we refer to as the discipline of constant dealing. The fact that the two agencies are repeat players. Each of them knows that if, when it loses a case it refuses to go along, then the other one will refuse to go along when it loses. Each of them knows that if every dispute ends up with people shooting each other, that will raise their operating costs, lower the quality of the service they're providing, and therefore each agency has an incentive to abide by its agreement to accept the decisions of the private courts. That's the basic logic of the system. And it has a couple of attractive features. The first is that unlike a political system, you have ordinary market incentives to provide a high quality of service. That from the standpoint of the rights enforcement agencies, they are competing with each other for customers. If the police come late, or if the police beat up the customer instead of protecting him, that'll be a reason to switch to another agency. So you have ordinary market pressure. Unlike a political system where the individual voter knows that his vote has essentially no chance of changing outcomes, the individual customer on a market correctly believes that he gets to decide which agency he buys the service from, so his decision is going to determine what happens to him. Second, and more interesting, it's a system which produces good law. Why does it produce good law? Because part of the product that each agency is selling its customers is the set of rules used by the arbitration agencies that it has arranged to settle its disputes with other agencies. From the standpoint of the rights enforcement agency, it wants to find private courts that interpret the laws in a way that makes their customers want to be under them. From the standpoint of the arbitration agencies, they want to develop legal rules that will make their customers, who are the rights enforcement agencies, choose to use them. So you have market pressure to develop law that is in the interest of the people who the law applies to. So that's the basic logic of how you would expect that system to work. And the most serious potential problems, I think, are problems of stability.
David, I'm going to interrupt you because I want you to be aware that the connection was lost. I could not hear you. I didn't see you on the screen. Were you able to hear him, Mike?
Hearing all the time. I didn't notice that you were gone, but then I noticed when you came back.
Yeah, I noticed that you were missing at one point, Jam, but I don't think I was.
Well, I just got a reading that said that the connection to this video had been lost. Maybe it was just me, so I didn't hear, but it's okay. Continue. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes. So I was explaining why a system of competing private rights enforcement agencies would produce good rights enforcement, and why the private courts that were settling disputes between them would have an incentive to produce good law. And then the stability issues, the first stability question is, will they fight each other? And the answer is they normally will not, because each of them will recognize that if they try to settle their disputes by fighting instead of arbitrating, that means that their customers will be getting a less reliable service, because the people who are in the right won't necessarily win the fight, but they would usually win the arbitration, and it means their costs will be higher. The real problem, I think, is the risk of the agencies getting together to reestablish government. That's what, from an economist standpoint, would amount to cartelizing the rights enforcement agency industry. That you could imagine two agencies saying to each other, let's make a deal. Your customers can't switch to us. Our customers can't switch to you. Now we can charge them whatever we want. We're in the position of a government collecting taxes rather than a private firm. If you end up with a very small number of agencies, I think that's a real risk. On the other hand, I think it much more likely, if you look at the fact that the most nearly equivalent industry in our present system, which is basically police protection, you don't observe that big cities get better police protection at a lower cost than small towns. So my guess is that the economies of scale in the rights enforcement business aren't going to be very large, that you will therefore have enough agencies so that if two of them try to turn themselves into a government, their customers will simply switch to other ones that will protect them from their previous protectors. So that, I think, answers in as much as I can in this short period of time the most serious criticism. I'm left with the one problem to which I have less good solutions, and that's defending against foreign nations. And the problem there is that if I spend to stop nuclear missiles coming at my city or an invading army, I'm protecting everybody else whether or not they've contributed. It's what economists call a public good. And there are a variety of ways in which public goods get produced on private markets. Open source software would be one example some of you are familiar with, where it's done by volunteers. Tipping cab drivers, you're producing a public good. You're giving them an incentive to give good service, even though you yourself don't expect to use the same cab again, and so forth. And I have a chapter in the new chapters for the 3rd edition of Machinery, which goes into some detail in describing a system in which national defense is the combination of a big militia of volunteers and a small cadre of professionals. And the volunteers are volunteering partly because some people like playing at being soldiers, if you think about paintball or Society for Creative Anachronism or things like that, partly because they're patriotic people who want to protect society for a variety of reasons of that sort. That provides you your manpower for free and a good deal of your equipment. You then would use charity to fund the small elite cadre of people who, in peacetime, would sell services to the militia, would say to the individual militia groups, you want to have a fake battle with each other, we'll referee and decide who would have won if it was a real battle, provide other services of that sort, and in wartime would coordinate. Part of the reason why two reasons why I think this is a believable story for the U.S. at the moment. The first is that we have no powerful enemies. That when I first wrote Machinery, the USSR was a going concern, and I was much more worried about national defense then. At this point, neither Canada nor Mexico is likely to invade us. China is very far away and is much more interested in selling us stuff than in attacking us. And as far as I can tell, although you certainly want some resources for national defense, I don't think they have to be enormous resources for national defense. And therefore, I think the sort of imperfect method I'm describing would probably work tolerably well. One advantage of the system I'm describing, as of the original system set up with the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, is that you eliminate the risk that the military will take over, which is a risk with any military, because most of the military is ordinary people in lots of small militia groups, volunteers, and if the professional military tries a military coup, they're going to be outgunned 1,000 to 1. And that was the original American system. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, David. That's time. All right, Jan, your 10-minute rebuttal.
Anarchism creates two classes of citizens, those that own the security agencies and those that don't. Whoever has more firepower rules. That's the problem. It's might makes right, and it's basically back to the state of nature, the law of the jungle, and predation will prevail. In the example that David gives about people, normally they will not fight, he says, that these agencies normally will not go at each other. What about when they do? When they do, it's war. It's a war. Right here in the United States, these security agencies have, some of them, I assume, small armies. And if they go to war, that brings in other people, collateral damage. Your city is in a state of war. That is so much worse than what we have now, even though what we have now is not a limited government. If it was limited, it would be much better than it is now. So I think that if you just look at a couple of examples, you'll be able to see why this system doesn't work. If you personally have a dispute with the owner of a security agency, do you think you have a chance to win this dispute? And will he, if you claim that he raped your sister, and this is a security agency that agreed to arbitration, and they decide that he's guilty and has to go to jail for 10 years, you think he's going to go to jail voluntarily? I think you're going to have to force him. Your security agency is then going to have to go to war if they want to make him go to jail for raping your sister. And guess what? A lot of these security agencies will not, or at least some, will not go to arbitration. They will offer different services. For example, some security agencies will offer the service of, we in-house will have the court and decide who's right. And if you're right, we will protect you regardless of what other people say. Other security agencies will say, well, we're going to do even better, but you're going to have to pay more. You're going to have to, we will defend you whatever you do because we think you're a good guy, and you'll have to pay more. And we're not going to go to arbitration, but it'll just be a more expensive service. Very rich people might be able to afford it. And then there'll be another kind of security agency, which is really a criminal gang, which is, we're going to defend your freedom and your rights against other people in exchange for you agreeing to do predation. That's what the criminal gangs in the ghettos do now. I mean, if you want to be safe, you join a criminal gang, but now you have to do their bidding and do predation and criminal acts all over the place. So there'll be all sorts of security agencies, and many of them won't have this arbitration. And whenever they go at each other, especially the latter two subsets that I mentioned, it's bloody war. And that's much worse than what we have now. So basically, this is compared to when, for example, a congressman violated my rights in our present system, which isn't even a limited government system. I sued him, and he had to pay me $45,000. Now, I wouldn't dare sue the owner of a security agency because he's above the law. He and his family and his friends are above the law. Two classes of citizens, those that have the firepower and those that don't. And guess what? It becomes even worse when the conflict is between one security agency owner and another security agency owner. So, for example, if one security agency owner kills another security agency owner in what he understands to be self-defense because he believes in stand your ground, the other security agency people, they don't believe in stand your ground. They think this was second-degree murder, like the Trayvon Martin case. Well, and they want blood. They're out for blood. You think that they're not going to use their military power to enforce what they think is fair? The point is, and one of the problems with this whole scenario of these security agencies is that the economic incentive is not always the highest value. People often value what they think is just. Nobody's going to go to jail if they think they're innocent. Even if they don't think they're innocent, they might not want to go to jail. So it doesn't trump everything. Economic incentive doesn't trump family. It doesn't trump what you think is fair. It's a consideration. And even if they lose customers, their reputation is tarnished, they will still prefer that than to go to jail. So this is a big problem with the whole anarchist system as it's laid out by David. Basically, you have the idea that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In our present system, we have division of the powers, and so we have a judicial, a legislative, and an executive power divided. We have division of government sphere. We have the states on the one side and the central government, federal government on the other. These things balance each other, and they prevent absolute power. So, for example, our president can be prosecuted. We can actually get him out of office and send him to jail. And if we don't like our elected officials, we can vote them out. But under anarchism, you can't vote any of these guys who are owners out. They have the little armies, and they are the mini tyrants. They're like mini kings. Now, let me go to the historical context, which is something that David investigates a lot. Something that often is not mentioned is that if you go back 1 million years of human beings being in existence, let's say, 994 of them, 994,000 of them, we had anarchy. That's what we had. And we had no prosperity, no development, no innovation, horrible lives, hand-to-mouth, subsistent, short and brutish lives, like Hobbes said in the Leviathan. It was so bad that political thinkers like Hobbes were willing to accept a tyrant rather than to have the state of nature. So that's the backdrop. We've actually had a lot of experience of what happens. Now, even modern examples, you say Somalia is now like an anarchist state. Well, who wants to go to Somalia? Do they have a high standard of living? Or the other example that's mentioned, Iceland, and they had an anarchist period. Well, what did they produce? What quality of life did they produce? An advanced civilization and prosperity and welfare like we have enjoyed in the United States? Let me go through a little bit about the history of the world, because apparently it's being missed in this discussion usually. It wasn't until there were some states, the Egyptian state, the Mesopotamian civilization, the Phoenicians, the Chinese, these were unlimited states. They weren't even limited like I would prefer. It wasn't until
Whoops, I think we might have lost Dan. That's no fun. Well, I guess Dan will do what he has to log back in. If he realizes he's gone. I suppose he can take the video, David, and edit it, right?
I don't know. I don't know whether he can take out these blank spots or not.
Yeah.
hear me. But anyway.
All right, you have 1 more minute.
Yeah, well, I lost a minute there because I was off air. So if you look at the historical context, you can see that limited government has produced great wonders and advances with all the failures that we've seen, where we have departed from our Constitution in many ways and become less limited. Still, the degree of limitation that we have permits us to live pretty good lives compared to what we can expect in anarchy. So if you want to know what anarchy is going to look like, it looks like a city ghetto where the police can't go in, and then you have gangs that divide up the territory. It looks like Watts when the police said, we're not coming in, wholesale looting. It looks like any of these situations where the government, the long arm of the law doesn't get there, like the jungles of Colombia, the mountains of Afghanistan. This is what happens when there is anarchism. Predation prevails, and it's only recently, very recently, that countries have stopped mostly their predatory mode, and that is in part because they aren't totally unlimited, and they have some degrees of a limited government. So, I'd like you to check out my...
Dan, that is time.
Okay.
When you were cut off.
I'm going to take 2 minutes more.
Okay, you're taking one of your options for 2 minutes more. Go ahead.
Right. What I wanted to mention is that I have, in other debates with Block and with the other fellow, I forgot his name, and Molyneux, I have explained why anarchism leads to an increase in crime. It increases the amount of crime exponentially because when the criminals are confronted with a central government, they have no chance to overpower it, so there's no incentive to increase military hardware. But once you remove the government out of the way, then criminals have a great incentive to acquire military hardware, and that creates an arms race because then the security agencies have to increase the amount of military hardware they have. The straggling individuals who are not associated, don't pay to a security agency a fee, they get picked off. The weak security agencies that don't have many guns or armies that want to do a cheap service and do arbitration and never fight, they will get picked off, and this creates an arms race. And then whenever any of these characters miscalculate, there's warfare, like I said before, full-out warfare in your city. And it's even worse when you consider foreign tyrants and foreign criminals. They send you a little note saying to any city, pay up or we will bomb you. And if you don't have a modern military that's coordinated and can either deter them with nuclear weapons or deter them through an invasion, when that means you have to have a massive army, it has to be coordinated, it can't be spontaneously put together on some moment's notice. If you don't have that, you cannot deter Kim Jong-il or Putin to extract any amount of money through extortion that they want from any city in the United States. And I explained in previously how these disagreements between the people will be greater under anarchy, and they will not... Okay.
Time's up. All right, so now we'll go to the question and answer portion. And on the questions, they're to be limited, as you will remember, to 20 seconds, the answers to 60 seconds. And first in that will be the affirmative will, let me see here, the 12 questions. Okay, so the affirmative will have 2 minutes for refutation. That's after the question period is over. So we'll start with the affirmative. First question for the negative, that will be David to Jan.
Yeah, I want to start by going back to the beginning of my talk and asking if you agree with my point that in your system we will have bad laws made, they will be poorly enforced, and the government will get us into many unnecessary foreign conflicts for the same reasons that you expect governments to do other things badly. So does your argument rest on the claim that even though the government will do these things badly, the alternative is worse?
Yes, I think that different governments, depending on how vigilant their citizens are and how much pressure they put on them and how good judgment they use when they have elected officials, and depending on how limited the government is, the more limited it is, the better they will function, because they won't be dealing with a lot of stuff that they shouldn't be thinking about, victimless crimes and being the world policeman. They can focus on just defending the individual rights of the citizens like a limited government should. To the extent that they conform more to that, they will be less inefficient. But I wouldn't say that you would expect the efficiency that you find in the marketplace. So it will be somewhat less than that, but it could be. It doesn't have to be horrible. And in any event, it's always better than the alternative, which is anarchism.
Okay.
Next question.
Question 2.
My next question is, you want your government to behave, to not have a war on drugs and not have various bad things. How do you get it to do that, given that in the political system, each voter knows that his vote has almost no effect and has no incentive to either know how to vote or to spend other resources influencing it, unlike a market where each customer knows that he gets to decide what he wants? So how do you make your system behave the way you want it to behave?
Well, I actually disagree with the premise that my vote doesn't matter, and that if the citizens are vigilant, as our founding fathers said they should be, to the extent, like I was saying before, to the extent that they're vigilant, and we have a limited government, they can keep supervision on what the politicians are doing, and they can vote them out, and they will and regularly do, and that system can work to not maybe a perfect degree, but a good enough degree to have the prosperity and great welfare that we have today in the United States, more than we have ever had any other time in the history of the world. So it's true that our system was and isn't completely limited, and there will always be some degree of violation of individual rights. But it makes a very big difference what degree it is. And if you have a small degree, it's far superior to anarchism. And on your point, it depends on what the founding fathers said you have to do. You have to have citizens that are persuaded that it's in their self-interest to defend individual rights of other people, that it's in their self-interest to fight not fight, but learn about what the right policies are and
Okay, Jen,
which are the better candidates.
Okay, Jen, was that an answer to the question, or were you challenging the false premise?
No.
No. I was answering the question in that I'm not. If I'm going to challenge him, I would challenge him to the moderator. I'm just saying I disagree with the premise of his question that there is no interest in the voters of knowing what the issues are or who are the better candidates, because their freedom is at stake, not the other people's freedom.
All right, thank you. All right, David, question 3.
Yes. It's hard to persuade people of things that aren't true. It is true that a great deal is at stake in an election, but what matters is the effect of your action. What do you believe the probability is that your vote will change the outcome of a presidential election? 1 in 1,000, 1 in 1,000,000, 1 in 10 million? And if it is something like 1 in 10 million, why would it be in your rational interest to go to a good deal of trouble figuring out what candidate was going to do what and how you should vote?
Well, I think that it is much less than 1 in 1,000,000, and I think that a lot of elections, like for example the election between Bush and Gore, came down to just a few, even less than 100 votes. I think those chads they were counting, in Florida, and that swung the whole presidential election. But other elections are smaller. That's the largest election we have, the presidential election. So I think that it's not only your own vote, but how many people you can persuade to vote for the right candidate. Leaders have an effect. Just watch and see what the people that dominate the media, their effect. For example, the majority leader just lost his seat to a guy who didn't have much funding. He was a Tea Party guy, Mr. Bratt. And how did that happen? Well, because certain people took an interest.
Let me go now to your critique of anarchy. You claim that might makes right, that concentrated power is the problem. You want to concentrate the power in one organization. I want to have it divided among hundreds competing with each other. In your system, when in fact the president, namely Bush, confessed to having committed a felony of using information obtained in violation of FISA, he did not go to jail because presidents have presidential immunity. Why don't you expect that the problems of power are going to be greater in a system where the power is concentrated in a small number of governments than where it's dispersed among many private firms?
Because each firm is like a mini government. It's a mini king, and they control everything. They control the executive, legislative, and judicial power. They control. The power is not divided like Montesquieu said it should be, and like we incorporate it into our.
Looks like we lost him again. He had 38 seconds left to finish. I guess we might be prudent and let him have most of the time when he gets back.
Yeah.
That's what happens, especially three connections like this, where one of us is going to fall off.
You're back on, Jan.
I finished my answer. I didn't know if I had taken more than my time because I lost my connection.
I don't think you finished your answer to us.
Did you hear my answer?
Only the beginning of it.
Okay.
So would you like to restate it?
Oh, okay. Well, when I say that the power is concentrated, and we both agree that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Each one of these security agencies controls all the power. They make the laws, they execute them, and even some of them have their own judicials or influence on the arbitrator or whatever. So they can do whatever they want. No, they're untouchable. And so their power is concentrated, even though there's many of them, which only makes things worse, because then if they have a dispute, there's a war, everybody suffers. Each one of them is like a mini tyrant. Whereas even the President of the United States, we can get rid of him, and you can sue a congressman and get him in jail, and congressmen are put in jail all the time
Okay, Jan.
for corruption.
David, question 5.
Yes. Why do you expect that a rights enforcement agency, which is producing rights enforcement in a very expensive way, namely by fighting people, will outcompete agencies that agree with each other to settle things peacefully? And why do you think that if you have a firm whose existence depends on maintaining its reputation for arbitration, since otherwise it's forced into a much more expensive form of production, that the rest of that firm would go along if the CEO decided, well, I committed murder, but I don't want to suffer the consequences?
Okay, well, there was two questions there, David, I think. Can I answer one first? The first one was, you want me to answer the last one or the first one?
Can I interject here? Maybe it'd be better that he asks you, start again and ask a single question, and so we don't get into an argument about how many questions were asked at the end of the thing.
All right. So the first question then is, we have two ways in which firms can operate. One of them is expensive and risky, namely, my customer is always right, I'll fight you if you disagree. The other is relatively inexpensive and reliable, namely, I accept arbitration when I lose, you accept it when you lose. Why do you expect the expensive form of production to win out over the inexpensive form of production?
Well, David, I didn't say there was just those two options. There's another option of a security agency who says, we're not going to defend you no matter what. We're going to have our own trial, and we have good judges, and we're going to defend you if you're right based on our trial. And then you have the other, you call it a security agency or a criminal gang, who they believe in predation. So obviously in that case, that's a whole different strategy of life, and they're going to cause problems in the anarchist system constantly. But the reason why, let's deal with the agency you're talking about, the one that says, I'm going to defend you no matter what. Well, why will they be able to survive? Because they're going to charge a much higher fee. And I'm not omniscient either to know which of these agencies are going to make more money or not. But what I'm trying to point out here is that there's a lot of other possibilities than everybody falling in line and saying, okay, we'll go for arbitration and we're going to abide by the arbitration. And so, no, that's not the only option. And let me make sure I answered.
Yeah, we're over time.
Okay.
All right. Question 6.
When your agency that has its own court, which is not the system I'm describing, tries to operate, how does it get other agencies to agree to accept that court? If it doesn't, isn't it back in the position where every conflict results in violence? And therefore, isn't it at a large disadvantage against those firms that agree that we will use a mutually agreeable court agreed on in advance? And doesn't that mean that it's going to go broke in competition to those agencies?
I was explaining in my previous answer that those other kinds of agencies will offer a deluxe service, which is they will incur in the risk of other agencies going to war with them. And you said these agencies are very reticent and reluctant to do that, by charging a higher fee. So which model is going to work, I don't know. But anyway, in the transition of all these working outs of all these arbitrators elaborating criminal law, civil law, criminal procedure, all these laws, by then the society is destroyed in that transition. So, but really answering your question, it is they're going to charge more money, and that's their strategy. They think they can make more money by offering a higher service and not going to arbitration, and offering what they consider to be a better quality of judges. Say they're all anarchists.
Okay.
So let me see if we can explore the how much money question. How much money do you think a criminal is willing to pay his agency in order to have an agency that will protect him? And how does that compare to how much money potential victims are willing to pay in order to have an agency that will not agree to go along with the agency that protects the criminals? In other words, don't you expect that the amount of money available to get rights protected is almost always larger than the amount to get them violated, and that therefore the agency that tries to sell your luxury service will discover that the cost of producing that service is more than it is worth to its customers?
Okay, David, that was about a 40-second question. So
Sorry.
Well, that's okay. I think I don't know, and I don't think you know either, all the different plans that are going to be offered. You think you're sure that the people that offer the cheap service where and it's not only just criminals, it's some people want to have their rights defended, and in a world where you're going to have all kinds of laws, different laws, people that think that drugs should be illegal, people that think they shouldn't, people that believe in, like you said before, in the death penalty, people that don't, people that believe in stand your ground, people that don't, and every bit of law that where there can be a dispute, there can be disputes, and so some people would prefer to have a known quality of judges and pay for it, and some people will just have alliances, and they'll say we'll protect each other no matter what the situation is, and that will be our payment. So we're going to pay in kind. So we protect each other, we fight for each other. And why is it that they prefer that? Well, they think they're more secure.
You said that nobody goes to jail if he thinks he is innocent. That is obviously false, since in our present system, lots of people go to jail who think they're innocent. They do so because they think that fighting is going to result in worse results than not fighting. Why wouldn't that be true here as well? Why wouldn't you find that the Rights Enforcement Agency CEO, who is not Superman, will not in fact have the resources to somehow break the agreement that his firm depends on at the point when he's the one at stake?
Yeah, here I'm going to have to get a ruling on what I consider to be a false premise, because I never said that nobody goes to jail if they think they're innocent. What I said was...
I think you can find that in the recording, Jan.
Well, okay, well, let me say what I said.
Not what you meant, but what you said.
We can get a ruling on that. What I said is that the owner of a security agency is not going to go to jail if he thinks he's innocent. I'm not saying that your average Joe won't have any alternative but to go to jail even though he thinks he's innocent. That, as you said, that happens every day. But they don't own the army. They don't own the armaments, the weapons, the military hardware. They have to go because they're confronted with a state which they can oppose. But if they had a chance to oppose them, they would.
All right.
What number question are we at?
We're at question 8, and he basically made a challenge here, and you have 60 seconds to respond to the challenge. He didn't answer the question.
What do you take his challenge? Oh, I guess is why would they have it go? But the answer is that these agencies are not governments. They do not have a monopoly over anything. They do not have any captive market. Their functioning depends on a flow of revenue, which depends on having customers. And at the point when they no longer accept arbitration, they can no longer provide the service they've normally been providing to their customers, which is being able at a reasonable cost to peacefully settle their disputes. Hence, the policy that you think the CEO can insist on his firm following is a policy which results in the firm going out of business, and it is very unlikely that he will get anybody else in the firm to support his following that policy. You have this dramatic imagination in which the CEO of a firm is somehow a king, even though that firm has no resources that 200 other firms don't also have.
Okay, but that wasn't the challenge. The challenge was that Jan claimed that you made a false claim as to he had said earlier in
Yes.
regards to nobody wants to go to prison.
Yeah, what I'm saying is if you check the recording, I think Jan will find that he said that nobody goes to jail if he thinks he is innocent, and that was then a step in his argument about explaining why the heads of the firms would not go to jail when they thought they were innocent. And I was pointing out that the statement wasn't true. But that week you can check the recording. It's presumably all.
Yeah, and probably that's what we might have to do to know. I heard it as nobody wanted to go to jail, wants to willingly go to jail. So the semantics might be there on either one of your sides. So and on that, maybe you could rephrase question 8 so Jan could answer it without that statement in there.
Sure. Then question 8 would be, given that the rights enforcement agency is a private firm which has to have customers in order to function, and that its functioning depends on its having a network of arbitration arrangements that other firms accept, why do you expect that the firm would suddenly change its policy when its CEO was at stake? Why do you imagine the CEO to somehow be a dictator or a Superman who gets to make all the decisions?
The answer is that the owner has the confidence of the people that work for him. They believe in him, and they believe his view that he was innocent. They're willing to fight for him. They're comrades in arms. They're brothers. They fight together. And in this case, he showed them the evidence. Look, I believe and stand my ground. This other guy attacked me, and so I had to kill him. It was not murder, regardless of what an arbitration court says or not. And he might have good evidence for that, like in the Trayvon Martin case. So that's why, and nobody that has the option to not go to jail, who owns a security agency and has the confidence of the people in the security agency and might in fact be innocent, is going to go to jail when he can stop it, and nobody's going to mess with him because he has the army.
Right. Just to let you know, I do give you 5 to 10 seconds before I even say time. That's over the 1 minute. So, okay.
Yeah. In the scenario that we're discussing, the rights enforcement agency has agreed in advance that all disputes will be settled by a specified private court, all disputes with some other agency. So the question is not, will the people in the firm, sorry, you better cancel that because I'm really answering rather than asking. I've got to put it as a question this time. Let me wipe out what I just said on the tape, and let me go back and think for a moment about how I can put it as a question. Why do you believe in your system, that in your version of my system, that members of a firm which has agreed to accept arbitration by a specified arbitration agency will say, just because we think that the verdict is wrong this time, we will break that agreement? That the question is not only what is just, but also what have we as a firm agreed to do as part of our normal activity? Why do you think they're willing to suddenly break that contract on behalf of somebody who maybe has persuaded them that he's getting a bad deal?
Well, let me tell you the variety of possibilities that there are. First, it could be a sole proprietor. He owns the whole company. He's not a CEO. He doesn't have any board of directors or anything. And he has the confidence of the people that he works for. He's treated them fairly. He's a decent guy. And in this case, he's innocent. And he has shown them the evidence. And he said, I'm not going to go to jail. What do you guys think? Should I go or not? They're going to say, no, don't go to jail. We'll defend you. And that's what they would do. And the whole point is, and this brings me back to the original point, economic incentive is not the highest value. People often do things that are against their economic welfare, economic incentive, because they think it's fair, or it's demanded by justice, or it's protecting their family, etc. And that's a good example. And once you have a firm where they all work together and they trust each other and they battle together, they're willing to go to bat for each other.
in your system, it is not clear to me yet what mechanism you think will limit your government. As you probably know, Rummel's estimate for the 20th century is that about 200 million people were murdered by their own governments. And you obviously don't want that to happen with your limited government. And the question is, do you have anything other than the belief that citizens will act against their own interest in monitoring the government and making sure it behaves to keep your government from behaving in the ways in which many past governments have behaved?
I dispute that premise again, that it's against their self-interest. You seem to think it is against their self-interest, but I dispute that. I think it is in every citizen's self-interest to allocate some amount of time and energy to determining which candidates are better and voting for the better ones, and trying to influence other people to do the same. And many citizens, by doing this, have swung elections, like I mentioned before about the recent majority leader who got wiped out of his office. So that's why I disagree with you. I disagree with your premise that it's against their self-interest. And I explained that people, when they're vigilant, like the Founding Fathers said they should be, can defend their freedom and keep check and balances on the leaders and the politicians. And of course, I don't accept the responsibility for these 200 million people that were murdered under totalitarian governments.
Okay, time.
And I'm working to prevent that.
Okay. So that was an answer to the question, not a challenge to the premise?
Yeah, I want to go.
It's an answer to the question.
Okay.
Back to the question of the voters. You pointed out that there has been one election in American history in which, if you happen to be in one of the 50 states, your vote had about one chance in 10,000 of changing the outcome. So that means that similarly, there have been times when if you had the right lottery number, you would have made a whole lot of money. That's not an argument for buying a lottery ticket. Again, what are the odds that your individual action, in your belief, will change the outcome of a presidential election, a congressional election? I note, by the way, that the Cantor case, that election went by several thousand votes. So it's not the case that one vote would have changed that or had any chance of changing.
Well, as I said before, there's small elections and big elections. In the bigger elections, each vote is less, and the amount of votes that you can cast is just one, but you can influence other people to cast votes, and people that get involved in elections can be very influential, like the election that I mentioned about the majority leader. He won basically because he got the support from some radio talk hosts who supported him, and that's what most people, why they explain that he won. So individuals can have a great effect on whether an election goes one way or another. And I think they should get involved, and it makes a big difference what candidate wins, and you cast your vote.
Okay. One more question, David.
Sure. You're saying that if you happen to be somebody like the talk radio host with a very, very large audience, it might be in your interest to try to influence a local election. Doesn't that mean that you're saying that democracy depends on a few influential people somehow having the same interest as the rest of the population, knowing what all the right answers are, Krugman, for example, and then doing the right things? I don't think you've given me any explanation of why the ordinary voter would find it in his interest to know enough about a complicated set of issues to vote for anything more than the person who sounds good or looks handsome or whatever.
Okay, well, maybe I can explain it better. What's at stake here is your freedom, your liberty. And since it's a big deal, it's worth doing a small amount of work or effort to be put in there to protect your freedom, your whole life, your property, etc., from tyranny. So if you value your life and you value your property and your freedom, then you will make your small or large contribution towards influencing the right choice in the elections so that you will be safe.
I think I get it
Okay.
2 minutes free if I've got it right that I can interpose, because I'd like to use about 30 seconds of it.
No,
Can I
Okay,
do that now?
you can do 2 minutes, but you can't do
Yeah.
30.
Do I have to do it all at once?
You have three additional 2-minute requests, so you'll
Sure.
have 2 more after that.
What you are saying is that it is worth going to all of the trouble of figuring out what the government should do and what the candidate is doing and so forth, because a great deal is at stake. But what matters is not only how much is at stake, but your chance of influencing it. After all, when the lottery is high, by buying a lottery ticket and winning, you can make millions of dollars, change your life forever. It doesn't follow you should try to buy a lottery ticket because your chance of winning is tiny, 1 in whatever, 10 million or 20 million or 30 million. Similarly, even if important things are at stake in elections, as occasionally they are, not too often because usually the candidates are pretty close, but even if important things are at stake, if you correctly believe that your action has a 1 in 10 million or 1 in 20 million chance of affecting things, it doesn't make sense to act. And if you look at how people actually behave in the real world, you discover that quite a large fraction of voters do not know who their congressman is, that almost everybody votes on beliefs that they could not defend, largely on what their friends and neighbors think they ought to do. So if you look at the world as we actually see functioning democracy now or 200 years ago, if you go back to early in this country's history, it seems to me that the behavior of voters is consistent with my explanation, namely that you vote for the fun of it, you vote to show what kind of person you are, that you have essentially no incentive to do the kind of monitoring that would be needed in order to make democracy actually an effective way of controlling government.
Okay. Now, that was more that wasn't a question, but that was using one of your 2-minute sections.
Right.
So now it's up to Jan to pose his questions.
Right.
Are you ready, Jan?
Yeah. Is it in your self-interest, rational self-interest, and other anarchists to spend time persuading people that anarchism is the optimum social organization?
I think it's in my self-interest, not mainly because I expect to bring anarchy, but because I think it's an interesting set of ideas. I enjoy talking about ideas with people. I enjoy explaining them to them. There is some very small chance that I'll have an effect. I'm in a sense in the same position as your talk show host in that I have visibility, I write books people read and so forth. So I've got more of an incentive than the individual voter does. But I would say that if the only reason for me to spend time and effort arguing for anarchy was the expectation of bringing anarchy, that would be an inadequate incentive. And there's only because there are other side benefits that come in from it that it's worth my doing it.
Well,
Question 2?
I need a ruling on whether that was a yes or a no. Let me repeat the question for clarity. The question is it in your and other anarchists rational?
It is my self-interest to do so.
Wait, let me ask this because I'm going to ask for a ruling on whether the question was answered, whether it was a yes or a no. And so I just want, for clarity's sake, to say the question again. Is it in your and other anarchists' rational self-interest to spend time persuading people that anarchism is the optimum social organization?
And the answer is it is in my interest to do so because I enjoy arguing with people. I enjoy working with ideas and trying to see what their logical implication is and trying to think them through. I enjoy various other side benefits that are associated with it. That, like most people who engage in political activity, it doesn't make much sense to do it if the only reason is the chance of affecting political outcomes. But in fact, like quite a lot of things humans do, it's motivated by a lot of, as it were, tie-in benefits you can get from doing it. So yes, it is in my interest, but the reason it's in my interest is not that I expect that my action will have a large effect on the chance of bringing anarchy.
So my ruling is David answered the question.
Okay, so was it a yes or a no?
It was a yes.
Okay, it is in your self-interest.
Yes.
Okay. Well, if it's in your self-interest to spend time trying to produce what you understand will be a method of producing good law, which will be good, why is it that you think that it is not in the self-interest of the citizens who believe in limited government to also try to persuade people that limited government is the best system, best social organization, and also that X candidate will be a better protector of your freedom than another candidate.
The question is whether it is in your interest to actually find out who is the better candidate, which is a costly activity. Many people believe they can do it for free, but half of them have to be wrong most of the time. Whether you're interested to actually find out what's going on and then spend your time and effort trying to change the outcome. And I can certainly believe that it's in the interest of lots of people on all sides of all disputes to engage in politicking. It's fun. Sometimes you can even get paid for it, depending on your context. But unfortunately, the payoff to you of arguing for policies doesn't depend on whether they're right or not. It only depends on a whole bunch of other things, because the payoff is not the effect of your action on the chance of the thing happening, but other benefits you get.
Well, I didn't understand what the rationale was for thinking that it's not in the self-interest of the citizens that want limited government to do exactly what you do and say is in your self-interest. You said it's in your self-interest to do this, and then you're saying when the people want to decide who is a better candidate, that's not in their self-interest, and that's why they won't do it, and it's stupid to think they will.
Dan, are you asking a new question?
I'm trying to get an answer to that question. I don't think it was.
I answered it.
Okay, so you're challenging again whether or not he answered the question?
Yes.
Okay. So let's re-ask the question and re-answer it and see if we've got a correct answer.
Yeah.
I can answer it again. I understand what the question is.
Okay, the question is, why is it that you believe that when people take time to figure out which candidate will defend freedom more, when they take time to advocate limited government, they are acting not in their own self-interest? Whereas when you take time to advocate anarchism, and you say you and other anarchists, when the other anarchists do it as well as you, that you're all acting in your self-interest. Doesn't make any sense.
The problem is that it is equally in the self-interest of the people who have the wrong policies that they're pushing. That it's being in your self-interest does not depend on your having the correct view of which candidate is better, or of having the correct view of what policy is better. That the benefits that people get by engaging in political activity, such as interacting with other people with similar views, getting people to pay attention to them, having the fun of arguing with people, whatever particular benefits people get, don't depend on their working for things that are true. On the other hand, the benefit from researching a product you're going to buy, if you make the wrong decision about which car you should buy, you end up with that car, and you're stuck with it. If you make the wrong decision about which candidate to support, your decision has almost no effect on who gets elected. In fact, you probably never find out it was the wrong decision, and therefore you have no incentive to actually spend the resources to get the right answer, as opposed to taking whatever answer you start with, or whatever answer is popular with your friends, or whatever answer will make you look good, and follow that. And if you watch political disputes, you can see that's what's happening.
Okay, I do find that you didn't answer Jan's question, because Jan's question was, in one circumstance you say it's not in their rational self-interest, and in another circumstance you say it is in their rational self-interest. So that was the nature of his question. And
so do you want me to try to give another answer? Because I thought it was clear, but maybe it's not clear.
Yeah, in other words,
my response is
saying your inconsistency in those two areas.
My response was that it is in your rational self-interest to engage in political activity, but that its being in your interest does not depend on whether the political activity is correct. That consequently, people who are arguing for limited government are acting in their rational self-interest. People who are arguing against limited government are acting in their rational self-interest. There is no incentive for people on either side to argue things that are correct, there are various other incentives that give them benefit from making the arguments. And so saying that people engage in political activity, which they obviously will, doesn't solve the problem that they have no incentive to make their activity actually correct, to actually know what's happening and know what candidates to support. Doesn't that answer the question?
Well, I think to restate it again, Jan was stating that in one case you were saying it's not in their rational self-interest, and that is in the case of voting, because you're not going to change the outcome of an election, etc. And then in the other instance of advocating anarchy, you were saying it is in their rational self-interest, and he was asking for you to.
In the case of voting, I'm not saying it's not in your rational self-interest to vote. I'm saying it's not in your rational self-interest to bear the costs necessary to know who to vote for. So you are voting. It is in your rational self-interest to vote. You get a little sticker which says I voted, and most of your friends say that means you're a good person. You get to feel good about it and so forth. But none of the payoffs from voting depend on your voting correctly. Just as my payoffs from supporting anarchy don't depend on my views being correct. I hope they're correct. I try to argue for correct views. But if I'm wrong, I will still get the same enjoyment from arguing with people as long as they don't find out I'm wrong. So you're not distinguishing. Yeah.
Dan, I think his answer is that you really don't get the logical, rational benefit from voting, and his advocating anarchy is not likely to bear fruits in bringing anarchy. So it's the same difference.
Okay, so basically, his answer is that when all this effort that he does to promote anarchy has no effect on whether there will be an anarchist system in the future.
Yeah, he did state that it's not likely to bring about it.
But not a large enough.
You're willing to do it anyway and waste your time on it because you like to talk and argue stuff.
I think we covered that one.
Okay.
We covered that one. Let's go to question 4.
Okay. Well, let's go to another topic. Under anarchism, will people be forced to follow laws they don't agree with?
Yes. That is to say, under anarchism, you will find that you have got to find some rights enforcement agency that you can hire to protect your rights, that you don't have an unlimited range of possibilities, and if the particular law you don't agree with is a law against murder, say, you will find that nobody is selling the service of protecting you if you commit murders. So the answer is that you will sometimes end up being under laws that you didn't agree to, just as is true in our system. Not as often because you've got some range of possibilities, but certainly it will sometimes happen.
Okay. Question 5.
This is 5. I thought it was 3.
What do you have? 3?
4. I'm sorry, 4.
We've done 4 and we're going to 5, right?
No, I think this was the 4th, but anyway.
Okay, well, I might have lost count there.
It's okay. Can you prove that anarchism is morally right?
No, I cannot prove that anything is morally right, and I don't think anybody else that I know of can prove it either. Nor can you prove that anarchism is morally wrong. Moral philosophy, unfortunately, has not made much progress in the last few thousand years, which is why philosophers still read Aristotle and physicists and economists don't. So I don't think I can prove moral things. What I think I can do is show reasons to believe that the kind of anarchy I advocate would produce a more attractive society, better outcomes in terms of what most people actually want. Whether they're right, I can't prove.
Question 5.
Either some defense agencies or security agencies have nuclear weapons or none do. Let's analyze each case separately. If they didn't have any nuclear weapons, what would happen if Putin or Kim Jong-il threatened to nuke your city if you don't pay $10 billion?
You're confusing rights enforcement agencies with institutions for national defense. As I thought I explained in my initial presentation, those are different sets of institutions. There's no reasons why a rights enforcement agency would have nuclear weapons. Using nuclear weapons is going to result in an awful lot of lawsuits against them by everybody else. It might be desirable that somebody have nuclear weapons. Sorry, did I run out of time? Have we lost someone? Oh, mic's off.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I got interrupted. Sorry.
Do you want me to start over again then?
Yeah, I don't know where I got interrupted. Somebody came in the office.
You are confusing two different sets of institutions in the system that I described. Rights enforcement agencies don't have the job of protecting against foreign governments. That's done by a different set of institutions. I sketched those in some detail in one of the chapters for the new edition of Machinery, which is up on my website. The rights enforcement agencies are very unlikely to have nuclear weapons, since setting off a nuclear weapon is going to result in an awful lot of lawsuits against them. There may possibly be other institutions that do, and I discussed a little bit some of how you would fund and maintain institutions of that sort. So I do assume that under some circumstances there might be threats that need a nuclear defense. Other circumstances there might not. You might be in an environment with no enemies, with big enemies, with small enemies, and so forth. But the rights enforcement agencies are not the people who are defending against nations any more than they're running the courts.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't think that my question was answered in that I'm asking the defense agencies or whatever other agencies you have in this anarchist society, let's assume they don't have nuclear weapons for a moment. Either they do have them or they don't. Let's analyze each case and see what happens. Assuming that this other agency that you say is different than a defense agency, a world defense agency, I don't know. Let's assume they don't have the nuclear weapons. What will happen if you get the note of extortion from Putin or Kim Jong-il to pay $10 billion? That's what I'm trying to find out.
Yeah, that's an issue I raised a very long time ago in print, about 40 years ago, I think, in Machinery. And that is a reason why, if there are powerful aggressive enemies, you have to have some form of national defense. And as I tried to explain in my initial presentation, that's going to be done by different institutions than the ones that handle domestic disputes among people. But if there are potential enemies likely to behave in the way you suggest, then it would be prudent to either have nuclear weapons or some other powerful, maybe the ability to assassinate Putin, but whatever mechanisms. But you'll have to have some mechanisms to defend against that. That's clear.
I don't think my question was answered, because I'm not asking what to do. I'm saying in this, there's just two possibilities. In the scenario that they don't have the weapons, what will happen?
In the scenario where they have neither.
The question after that will be, what we'll analyze, what will happen if they do have the weapons. So,
all right, moderator.
My question is,
moderator time. Moderator time.
It's possible. Okay.
Here's the confusion. David has been addressing domestic issues in his arguments. Now you're going to an international scenario. David has mentioned that he hasn't covered the international scenario or the national defense scenario in this debate. So that the missing part there is whether or not, or what this agency is that will deal with these kinds of threats. That's missing in this discussion.
I, in fact, did give a very brief sketch of how to do it in my initial presentation, but not a very detailed one.
But what I'm asking is, whatever you want to call that institution, not a defense agency, a DRO, or an international defense agency, or whatever you want to call it, there's just two possibilities. Either they have nuclear weapons or they don't, right? And it's just, there's going to be just one of these institutions, right?
No, it does not follow there will only be one.
There could be several of them.
Either there is somebody, some firm or group of firms or voluntary organization, there is some organization within the society which has weapons sufficient to either stop nuclear attacks or to deter them, or there aren't. Those are the two alternatives. Now, if the answer is that there are no such, then if there are aggressive foreign powers that want to extort in the way you described, the system isn't going to work very well, because they'll do what you've described. That answers your question.
Okay. They will pay the extortion. Okay. Let's analyze the other possibility that these international defense agencies will have nuclear weapons or a conventional army that's sufficient to invade another country like Korea, and they could be deterred by an invasion of their country like we did in the Korean War. That would mean that they would have to have enormous millions of men to be able to invade over there, or they would have to have nuclear weapons, various of these international defense agencies. So if that was the case, that you have international defense agencies that have either enormous conventional weapons or nuclear weapons, what will happen when there is a dispute between one or more of these international defense agencies, and one of them happens to be headed by a neocon who thinks the other is going to bomb him first?
22nd question or a rebuttal?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I was letting him go on.
Okay, I'm sorry, I took too long.
Right.
What's going to happen when this guy decides to do preemption and nuke the guy on the West Coast? He's on the East Coast before he thinks the other guy is going to nuke him. What will happen to the country in that case?
To begin with, as I tried to explain in my initial presentation, the best solution I know to the problem of keeping the military from taking over, whether with a government or without a government, is something like the original militia system, in which most of the manpower consists of lots of volunteers in many small groups, and you have a fairly small professional military funded basically by charity. So the first half of the question, especially your large army question, is that you don't want to have any large army that one person controls. The second half of your question is that if there are nuclear weapons, you will face precisely the same problem we now face, namely, how do you set up institutions in which no individual has direct control over those weapons? And there are lots of ways of structuring firms, nonprofit organizations, volunteer groups, and so forth, other than sole proprietorship. And so if you are raising money in order to buy a nuclear missile to threaten Putin with if he ever threatens us, you will find it prudent to reassure the people who are contributing the money that that weapon will not be something that you can fire at anybody you feel like anytime you get angry.
Okay, question number 7.
Well, is it possible that there can be a dispute between these international defense agencies, either because they think they're going to attack each other, they don't trust each other, there's some kind of dispute where they end up attacking each other, or another possibility where they could attack each other, one of them thinks the other wants to take over the country, and because they have all this military power, as the other one says, well, before you do that, I'm going to knock you off because he's a neocon. Is there a possibility that these agencies, different agencies with nukes, will go at each other and we'll have a nuclear war right here in the United States? Because
okay, Jan, that was 2 questions. Jan, that seemed like 2 questions to me, and it was a minute long. So is it?
So sorry. Can we distinguish? Moderator, what do you see as the 2 questions?
Well, I had a question about one agency internationally against say an agency here, and then two large agencies domestically, going after each other with nukes. So
that's a misunderstanding. I'm only asking if you have international agencies in the United States that they're supposed to deal with national defense, and various of them have nuclear weapons. Is there a possibility that they will have a conflict which will lead to attacking each other, whereas in the situation now, with just one government, it's not going to attack itself, so you don't run that.
Yeah. just ask the question without giving
the first answer is that since we don't have really good theories of how societies work, almost everything is possible. The real question is whether the risks under the system I'm describing are greater or less than the risks under the system you are describing. As it happens, in case you haven't noticed, there are nations with nuclear weapons probably targeted at us and have been ever since the late 1940s. The only people who have actually used nuclear weapons on anybody are governments, namely our government, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I think under any system, once the weapons exist, there are ways things could go wrong that result in their being used. But it seems to me that the risk of that happening, given the nature of international politics and the tendency of governments to get involved in other governments' quarrels, is a great deal higher than the risk of some bizarre set of circumstances in which people have paid to set up a retaliation. They've set it up in ways designed to make sure nobody can fire it unless we're attacked by the Russians, but then somehow everything goes wrong and you get a Dr. Strangelove story. It's not impossible. Almost nothing is impossible. But unfortunately, it is not impossible that the U.S. will get into a real thermonuclear war. We came moderately close to it in the past.
Okay, thank you. Ready for question 8?
Do you think criminal gangs will extort money from individuals that are not organized, as well as security agencies they consider weaker than themselves? I'm talking about militarized criminal gangs, where they have military hardware. They have.
The answer is that the value to people of being protected is greater than the value to aggressors of attacking them. And therefore, if you set up a system where those values show up in what people are willing to spend to get the outcome, the defenders, the private agencies that are selling protection, are going to have much larger resources than your gangs are, and therefore the gangs are going to be unsuccessful. So I do not think that now, as far as people who have no protection at all, what happens to people who aren't customers of rights enforcement agencies, if there are such people, is going to depend on how generous the agencies are about treating them and so forth. Might go badly, might not go badly. But of course, in our system, as you may have noticed, there are quite a lot of people who effectively are unprotected. That there are sizable areas in the U.S. where there are high crime rates, murder rates, and so forth, even leaving out the crimes committed by governments. So, yeah, I mean, under any systems, things may go bad for some people sometime, but less likely in a market system than a political system.
Okay.
I want to make sure I understood the answer to the question. So you think that the criminal gangs will extort money from individuals?
Will fail to succeed in that they will be unsuccessful in that attempt. As far as anybody who is the customer of a rights enforcement agency.
Okay, well,
and I also think on the evidence of the small fraction of government expenditures that actually goes for police and courts, that the cost of being a customer of a rights enforcement agency will be much lower than the taxes actually paid by poor people at present. So that in fact, poor people at present will be better off if they are no longer paying the taxes they're now paying to government, and instead are spending a few $100s a year for a customer with to be customers of rights enforcement agencies.
Okay, that's going beyond the answer to the question.
Yeah, but I wanted to get the answer to this question. See if is it that they will attack the individuals that are not associated with defense agencies, but they won't attack the weak defense agencies, because all the defense agencies will be stronger than them. Even though these criminal gangs are militarized, they have tanks, tomahawk weapons.
Hold on before you answer.
20
David,
seconds.
hold on. Dan, hold on. Are you asking a new question, Jan?
No, I'm just trying to. I want to know I don't think I got a clear answer to whether it's a yes or no answer.
But you're trying to not only re-ask the question, but make an argument as well.
Okay.
Yeah, you are putting a little bit of that in there, Jan. I think he answered the question. He answered it
was it yes or no, David?
It was a yes with an explanation.
Okay, well, it was yes, they will attack the individuals, but they will not attack the agencies?
No.
They might attack individuals, but if so, it is unlikely there will be many unprotected individuals for them to attack, since it will be worth even poor people having protection.
Yeah, he said yes, it might happen, but he said it would ultimately not play out very well for folks that try to do that.
Well, previously, you said that these defense agencies did not have armies, and now you're saying that they do because a criminal gang that has military hardware, a little army, will not attack them because all the defense agencies will be stronger, which means all of these defense agencies, hundreds of defense agencies, will have little armies. So isn't that a contradiction?
You're assuming the existence of criminal gangs with lots of military hardware.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to happen. If you had criminal gangs with military hardware, then the rights enforcement agencies might end up having to have military hardware as well. But I think it's quite unlikely because you will find, attacking poor people who can't afford, extorting poor people who can't afford any defense really is not going to get you very much money. It's not going to pay for very many tanks. And in general, the basic economic problem with your model is that the value to people of having their rights protected is much larger than the value to other people of being able to violate them. And the result is that the resources available for protection will consistently be larger than the resources available for predation. And the result, therefore, is that you're not going to see your imaginary armies of people with tanks. But if you did, then, of course, the rights enforcement agencies would need some tanks, too.
Now, Jan, just for a little admin clarification here, was that your 9th question?
I don't know if it was the 9th or the 8th, but anyway.
I have it down as the 9th because I don't know if you were asking a new question or
there I was just asking for clarification, but I'll go to my next question, which is, right now, criminal gangs are
I think I'm still here, but
missiles or drones. They just show up easier on the government's radar, and the government takes them out. But when you remove the government, all those activities, buying tanks, having drones, Tomahawk weapon missiles, all that is okay. They can do it. And the question is, will they not be incentivized to get this military hardware, because every step up in their armaments, in their weapons, increases the pool of potential victims? That's my question. Is there an incentive for them to do that?
The first point that I think you're missing is that the revenue of criminal gangs at the moment comes almost entirely from doing things that the government forbids, from selling drugs, to some extent from prostitution and gambling. So none of the revenue sources currently available to those gangs are going to exist in a libertarian anarcho-capitalist society. Beyond that, my point repeated is that the value to people of being protected is greater than the value to other people of extorting them, and that therefore your imaginary criminal gangs are going to find that it costs more to get enough resources to win against people who are willing to pay to be protected than in fact it's worth.
So your answer is that I want a clarification on this answer. Is there an incentive for them to get military hardware to increase the
inadequate incentive? An inadequate incentive. They will find that spending money on that will make them poorer and not richer.
They will, but you admit that they will have more potential victims if they do that.
But at a cost. They will have to have the resources to deal with the fact that the victims that are worth attacking, the ones who have anything, are also willing to pay to be protected.
Okay.
Question 10.
Will some of the security agencies representing citizens have disagreements, and will some of them use force to impose their judgment?
The answer is that they will not end up with disagreements because they will be pre-committed to arbitration, and they will use force to impose their judgments. That is to say, when the arbitrator that your agency and my agency have agreed to concludes that you in fact did steal my television set, If you refuse to give it back, my agency will send some goons to take it back, and your agency won't protect you, because part of the deal is that when they lose the court case, they go along with the verdict, and when we lose the court case, we go along with the verdict. So the answer is that there will be force used, but the force will be used to enforce verdicts reached by arbitration agencies, by private courts, that the rights enforcement agencies have agreed in advance to abide by.
So let me get a clarification on your answer. So it's your answer that they won't have any disagreements, even though they don't agree on law or anything else. Is that the answer to my question? They won't have any disagreements?
That's what he
I'm
said.
sorry.
That is what he said, Dan.
It would be useful if you were familiar with the system I was proposing in advance, which is why I suggested you're reading things. What I am saying is that the agencies will have pre-agreed to private courts. They will have disagreements when they're doing that. Some of them will want courts with some rules and some with others. But they will find it in their interest to agree to private courts. And once they have agreed to private courts, it's in the interest of the agencies to go along with the verdicts of the courts they've agreed to. That does not mean that it's in the interest of their customers to go along, and so force may sometimes get used against somebody who is trying to defy the verdict that was reached by the court, agreed to by both his and the other party's rights enforcement agency. I hope that's a clear enough answer, but it's not like the world consists of things to which there are very simple yes and no answers.
But they will have disagreements or they won't?
They will have disagreements in advance when they are negotiating agreement on private courts. They will have disagreements before a trial, but they will agree to accept the verdicts of the private courts that they have agreed in advance to accept the verdicts of, because each agency knows that if it breaks its agreement to abide by court verdicts, the other side also won't keep them, and each agency knows that it can reduce the service it's providing, namely rights protection, at a much lower cost through arbitration than through violence.
Okay. Question 11.
Will some of the people running security agencies decide to initiate force against less armed citizens?
I think not, because the question is not whether the citizens are armed. The question is the citizens themselves have rights enforcement agencies first. Even if they don't, there may not be much reason to. But in any case, I expect that practically everybody will be the customer of a rights enforcement agency, and it is not in the interest of a rights enforcement agency to start a fight. It will have arbitration agreements with the other agencies, so if they initiate force, the other agency calls for arbitration in the court they've agreed to, the court rules against them, and they owe damages. That seems like a pretty simple system.
Question 12.
Is somebody cut off?
No, I think we're all here.
I have one last question, right?
Yes.
Oh dear. Do you think that there aren't going to be any disagreements about what is the right criminal procedure, what is the right civil procedure, whether X action should be a crime, whether what is the right punishment, that every tort law, contract law, inheritance law, all these big tomes that I had to study when I was in law school, there's going to be do you think there's going to be any disagreements, or do you think that this arbitration institution is going to have figured out all the law and agreed on all these things, and therefore there will never be any disputes between these security agencies? Which is that your position?
No, that is not even close to my position. It would. I'm sorry. I'm feeling frustrated. We are not talking about a arbitration agency. We are talking about a network of contracts in which there are pairwise contracts between every pair of rights enforcement agencies specifying an arbitrator. the private courts may have different legal rules, that part of what comes out of the disagreement, I spend some time in one chapter of Machinery in the imaginary case where customers of one agency prefer legal rules with capital punishment and another agency without capital punishment. And the point is that the agencies have an incentive to bargain, to try to figure out how much getting their preferred rule is worth to their customers. The private courts have an incentive to try to figure out for any pair of agencies what is the set of legal rules that they would most like to buy for their customers. So I am assuming not only that there will be no disagreement, I'm not even assuming that there will be no diversity. I assume that a case between you and me will occasionally come under a different legal rule than a case between Mike and me, depending on what our agencies are and what they've agreed to. So the point is not that there's no disagreement. The disagreement is what gets settled in the bargaining process by which the rights enforcement agencies agree on private courts, agree on the arbitration agency that will deal with them.
You okay with that, Dan?
Yeah, let's go on to the next section. I mean, what can we do?
So the next section is we're going to have the affirmative. We'll have 2 minutes for refutation of, I guess, anything that's gone before. So that's you, David. You can refute anything you want to refute.
Sure. Let me try with the first problem with Jan's whole argument in view of the situation is that he imagines that everything in the world is a government. That he keeps thinking of private firms selling the service of protecting people's rights as being mini-governments, despite the fact that, unlike government, they don't have a captive market. There isn't a set of citizens who have to pay them taxes. They can't collect taxes. All they can do is to offer on the marketplace a service, and if that service does not offer a better deal for the price than the services offered by their competitors, they have no revenue with which to do anything. So that's the underlying problem, is his thinking in that way. Let me mention a couple of brief things. He mentioned Somalia. My guess is that he doesn't know very much about it, because most people don't. The actual history is that Somalia, and in particular Somaliland, northern Somalia, had a functioning stateless system up to the point at which Italy and England combined the areas they had been responsible for into the state of Somalia about 1960, at which point they set up a modern democratic government. That turned into a military dictatorship. That got into a war. That then collapsed. Ever since then, the U.S. and the UN, with the assistance of Ethiopia, which is Somalia's traditional enemy, have been trying to reestablish a government. And the people around Mogadishu figured out that if there was going to be a government, it would be better to be the governor than the governed. So that's a particular case where we've actually done the experiment of replacing a previous stateless order with a state, and the result was a whole lot of bloodshed and violence, which we continue to contribute to. As far as the comparison of how well stateless versus state systems do, you want to make apples-to-apples comparisons. I am sure that hunter-gatherers 20,000 years ago were poorer than we are. But if you compare, for example, Norway and Iceland, during the period when Iceland had a semi-stateless system in which there were courts and a legal system, but there was no government enforcement of the verdicts. It was entirely privately enforced. And you observe that the... What?
2 minutes. We're at 2 minutes.
Then I'm going to use one of my other 2-minute things to continue to finish this. We observed that what actually happened in that system was that there was a relatively low level of violence in Iceland. There were certainly some conflicts and some killings, but mostly it was very small scale. And if you compare it to what was happening elsewhere, you observe that Norway, England, and Normandy in 3 weeks of the year 1066 seem to have killed a larger fraction of their population than the final 50 years of breakdown of the Icelandic system after it had been functioning for almost 300 years. So the evidence suggests that when you compare comparable systems, indeed, the stateless one looks pretty good. And in terms of what the Icelanders accomplished, there are probably a dozen books written in Iceland in the Middle Ages currently in print in English translation. That's a population of 70,000 people 700 years ago at the far edge of the world. So that if we judge by cultural output, Iceland has got to rank along with Periclean Athens and Elizabethan England as one of the highest cultural output per capita societies we know of. enough.
Okay.
My turn?
Your turn, Dan.
Okay, here's the list of the contradictions in David's thinking. First, he thinks that it's in his self-interest to promote anarchism, and at the same time, he doesn't think it's in the self-interest of the people that want to advocate and vote for candidates that will defend their freedom or advocate limited government. Either it's in the self-interest of him to do so, and it's also in our self-interest, or it's in neither. Also, with regards to this self-interest issue, if you cannot achieve your objective, which is ostensibly to persuade people that anarchism is a better system of providing law, what's the point in doing it? Just because you like to talk about it? No. I try to persuade people that limited government is best because I think that my efforts will have some effect. If your efforts are having no consequence, like you say, then there's no reason to do it. Here's another contradiction. First, in his initial talk, he says, normally they will not fight. In other words, sometimes these defense agencies will fight, but later, he said, they will never fight. So that's a contradiction. Thirdly, an issue that isn't handled well by his system is the transition. In other words, it takes decades to go through all these laws and come up with all these answers with all these arbitration companies to get on the same page, and still they have differences. But in the meantime, there's lots of differences, and there isn't any way to resolve it, and you have civil war, gang warfare between the defense agencies.
2 minutes.
That was time?
2 minutes.
Okay, I'll take 2 more minutes.
Okay.
These different, I've said that he cannot guess that there will be only one kind of defense agency that all of them will agree to arbitration. I've given him 3 examples of plans that defense agency people could offer where they don't go to arbitration, and he thinks that they won't be successful, but maybe they will, and we can't project whether they will or not. I would say that initially it might be appealing to a lot of people to have a defense agency that they believe in, and that will defend them if their court says everything was okay and they're innocent. So here's another contradiction. The defense agencies will have armies, they won't have armies. First he says that they won't, but then when I explained to him that it's in the interest of the gangs to increase their armaments and get military hardware to increase their pool of victims, he said, well, no, the defense agencies will have armies and they will be able to defend against them. So that's a contradiction. Either they have armies or they don't have armies. It's not possible that both are true. And here's an interesting thing. I say, he says there won't be any disagreements. Wow, how can he know that and none of them will decide to use force to enforce what they think is right and just and fair? Of course they will. And there will be plenty of disagreements. There'll be more disagreements then than now. Why? Because now at least we know for sure what the law is. Under anarchism, we don't know what the law is. It can be any number of possibilities. You can have Sharia law, you can have common law.
Time.
That was time? Okay.
Yep.
Right.
Okay, so you have 1 minute, David, to reply to.
Oh, I missed that part. I've got a 1 minute to reply to him. I missed that. Yeah, I'm not being inconsistent in the least. I do not expect that there will be armed gangs with tanks, for reasons I tried to explain. But if there were armed gangs with tanks, then naturally the rights enforcement agency would need some tanks. When I say if A were true, B follows, but A is not true, I am not being inconsistent in saying that B is not true. So far as the transition, I am not in favor of pushing a button and instantly abolishing government. I'm in favor of some kind of a continual shift in which government becomes less and less important over time and private institutions take over. Let's see. I'm still puzzled as to why you don't understand the distinction between having an incentive to take political action and having an incentive to take the correct political action. That in the market, you have an incentive not only to try to decide what car to buy, but to get it right because you're going to get that car. In the political system, you have an incentive to act, but not necessarily to act correctly.
Okay, thank you. You have 1 minute, Jan?
Yes, let's go over the history of anarchy. We have 994,000 years of history. That was tribal warfare in Africa. They never produced anything. It never got anywhere. Life was short and miserable. So the same thing with this Iceland experiment. They never produced a great civilization. They never produced the prosperity that we have. What did produce the prosperity? First, states, and not the best ones, monarchies and emperors. And then it got even better when we introduced limited government. So the only thing that's increased the quality of life and standard of living in the world is the American experiment with limited government, and I'm quite grateful for it. Now, if you say if there were tanks, then they would arm up, and that's the point. When they will get tanks and armaments and drones to increase their pool of victims. Then the other people, the defense agencies, have to build up their tanks and build up their armaments, and that's an arms race. And that's what happens under anarchy, an arms race. Eventually, the Civil War, somebody miscalculated.
I now have, what, 2 minutes or 3 minutes for a summary?
Yes, let me get the exact on that for you.
I'm not sure I have.
All right, each debater will be, let's 3 minutes for summary. So
isn't that what he just did?
No, he did a minute reply to your.
But before that minute reply, wasn't he doing his summary?
No.
He was doing. What was he doing? His rebuttal. I'm sorry. I'm confused about who was doing what when.
Okay, you're both. You were refuting what had been statements made by Jan earlier, and he in turn refuted your statements. And then you had a reply of 1 minute to his refutation, right. And then
so
he had
at this point, am I supposed to be? At this point, am I supposed to be giving my summary?
At this point, you'll give your summary.
And that's 3 minutes, and he gets 3 minutes for his summary.
Correct.
And I've still got 1 2-minute extension if I need it, I think, or 2 of them. I'm not sure. Did I use 2 of them?
Yeah. So you have 1 more.
I have 1 more. All right.
How many do I have?
You have 1 more as well.
Okay.
All right. There are really 2 basic issues here that we're disagreeing on. One of them is how his system works, and one of them is how my system works. And the question of how his system works, I started out assuming that as a libertarian he expected government to work badly. It's not clear to me if that was right, and not entirely clear to me why he wants to limit his government so much. But that being said, he doesn't seem to understand the standard rational ignorance argument for why democracy is unsuccessful in any large polity. And the argument is very simple. It is that it is quite costly for individuals to know enough to actually control the government by their votes, that the payoff for doing that for individuals, except for very rare and influential individuals, is very, very low, and that, in fact, as you observe, most individual voters don't know all of the things they would need to do to know in order to do a good job of controlling government. And it is therefore not surprising that despite the fact that economists concluded that tariffs were a bad idea about 200 years ago, practically every government in the world still has tariffs for well understood reasons, which depend on the difference in what's in the political interest and what's in the actual interest of the country. So that's the first half. The second half is the question of my system. And there, Jan keeps making the mistake of seeing the world through the eyes of governments, of imagining that my agencies are mini-governments, when my agencies are firms that are trying to sell services to people. They are firms that have no special rights that anybody else doesn't have. The firm is no more in a position to say we can commit crimes and you can't than anyone else has. It's got a tiny fraction of the total force of the society. It is very unlikely to have much in the way of tanks, drones, and the rest of that stuff for the same reason that sensible police forces don't, because the function it's providing is protecting people against ordinary criminals and arranging the settlement of their disputes. Jan doesn't seem to understand that this is not a system where everybody is agreeing on a single set of laws. It is a system where every pair of agencies are agreeing on the laws that apply between them, and individual customers are then choosing agencies in part on the basis of the laws that they have agreed to. So Jan keeps thinking that he can critique my system by imagining things that could happen without having any decent theory of what will happen. And I have a very simple theory of what happens in a market, namely that firms that produce a service at a high cost tend to be driven out by firms that produce the same service at a low cost, that firms that produce a higher quality service where the value of the quality is less than its cost find that they go bankrupt, that the service of protecting criminals is worth very much less to the criminals than it costs to produce, because of the fact that in order to produce it, you have to either get all of the victims' firms to agree to it in order not to fight them, or you have to have a continual set of fights, your firm fighting everybody, everyone else arbitrating among themselves, at which point your firm has much larger costs than theirs do and goes bankrupt. So the basic...
Minutes going on.
What?
Yeah, you hit your 3 minutes. You want your additional 3 minutes?
I will save that until the very end. Thank you.
Okay.
No, he has to take his. This is your last chance to talk, David. You have 2 more.
I don't get to take my 3 minutes in response to you?
No, because you have to take it. The debate will be ended when I finish my summary. So you can take your 2 minutes now if you want.
Right. I guess I would like to spend it at least briefly on Jan's rather simplistic view of history. We don't observe in general that when governments became more powerful, people became richer. We observe that there have been powerful governments going way back. Quite often, the powerful governments made people worse off. People like to view the collapse of the Roman Empire as a catastrophe, but if you look at what was actually happening to the population of Europe, you discover that the transition from a single state ruling the Mediterranean world to a whole lot of tiny states, baronies and such, more or less competing with each other, which was certainly not my system, but was farther from his system than the Roman Empire was followed by an increase in population. That population was falling through the late Roman period, started back up with the Roman Empire barely cold in its grave. That part of the problem, part of the reason people have the illusion Jan has, is that when you have a strong central government, it can divert resources from the periphery into the capital, build magnificent monuments, pay people to make magnificent symphonies, and then we say, look, isn't that a great civilization? And we're ignoring the hungry peasants who were paying for all of it. Whereas if you have a much more decentralized system, the population on the whole is better off, but you've got less glitter in the capital because the capital isn't in a position to appropriate money. So that, anyway, the historical thing would be a very long argument, but I think the idea that somehow progress starts when you create government and you have more progress with more government, or only suddenly you have more progress with less government, is his view about limited government, does not make a whole lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Dave, Jan, before you get started, do you want to take your 2 minutes along with your 3 minutes?
Yeah.
All right. So go ahead.
Let's start with the history. The history which has not been refuted is that anarchy had 994,000 years to get anything going, and it didn't. It was with the first states about 6,000 years ago, where you had irrigation systems, where you could have greater productivity in agriculture, where you had some surplus where you could dedicate to studying mathematics and science and culture and whatever to improve the quality of life. Now, David seems to think that, and that quality of life improved through the Athenian time, the Roman time. He thinks that the Middle Ages was a great time. I think not. That's why they call it the Dark Ages. And
they don't call it that anymore, Jan.
What?
They don't call it Dark Ages anymore. No historian uses that term.
Wait, you make it hard on the moderator. It's Jan's turn to talk.
Sorry, but he's 40 years out of date.
Okay, well, this is not from my time, right?
No, it's not from your time.
Sorry.
Okay, give me back my time. Okay, I call them the Dark Ages because what prevailed then was faith and force by the military fiefdoms and the church, and people live short and miserable lives. And if you want to look at population growth, it grew in the 19th century when we had the Industrial Revolution, which came because we had the Age of Reason, and all of that happened with states. And then the Age of Reason produced the rights of man, and we came with the experiment of limited government. And then this limited government has produced a great life, very successful. See, that's a difference that we have. I think that limited government has been very successful. You refer to state government or unlimited government, and you want to attribute that view to me, but that's not my view. What I'm pointing out is that the population growth and prosperity and standard of living increased tremendously when we had limited government. And as these monarchs started to moderate and limit and grant more rights to the citizens, prosperity came forward. So that's a basic difference of opinion we have with history. And as I said before, Iceland did not produce any great achievements in their anarchist period. They did not produce what we have now, even close. Somalia, either. It's horrible to live in Somalia. Nobody wants to go there, rightfully, because it's not any good. Now, a very important point that David doesn't understand is that you need modern armies that are already assembled, that aren't just you have a small professional army and then you bring in all these volunteers. No, that's like having a football game where your players don't practice and they're not ready to play until the day before, and you find out who's on your team. It's never going to work. As I said before, part of what's the problem is that in many choices in life, economic incentive is not the highest choice. I gave an example of why a security agency owner would not go to jail, and his organization would defend him because they're comrades in arms. And in fact, in the example I gave him, it was pretty clear that he was innocent. Trayvon Martin attacked him, and so he shot him, and that's the way it happened. But other people disagree. Other people think that that was first-degree murder, and that agency, that family was out for blood. They didn't care what it cost. That's the point. So, besides that, as I point out, there's some contradictions here where they say that he says that if there are armed tanks, then they would get armies. He also says that they would normally not fight. That means sometimes they would. All it takes is a few times of war between agencies where you have civil war. That's the problem, and everybody knows that, and that's why they don't want anarchy, because they know it leads to civil war. And that's the reason, because the disputes lead to armed conflict. And you agree that sometimes this happens. So, besides that, I just wanted to say that David is a gentleman, and I've enjoyed debating with him. But I do think that he doesn't understand, and he's trying to predict what will happen in the future, and you cannot know a lot of these things, and it's not worth the risk.
That's time. So, but the gentleman part wasn't part of your argument, so that was good. I think.
Can we talk any more now once the thing is over? Because there are a couple of points I wanted to make.
We can't talk. Our debate's over. We can reschedule another one if we want.
I was thinking about a public debate. I just was thinking about conversation off the air.
All of this is on the air, David. So what proceeds now is, unless the moderator has to say something or I guess we just thank each other for the debate.
I enjoyed
I
arguing
was
with
a
you,
little
but
bit
I wish I
exuberant.
had time to argue with you a great deal more because many of these are somewhat complicated questions.
Well, you
Okay.
know what?
I'm gonna
You guys, are you
turn
still there,
off the
Jim?
broadcast, and then we can talk if we want.
Right.
All right.
Bye.